Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirant. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
So welcome for this episode of Disrupt Your Career to Monique Valcour. Monique is a coach, a speaker, a leadership development professor based from the Nice area of southern France and working across the world. Thank you so much for joining us, Monique.
It is my pleasure, Claire.
Thank you, thank you. We're both blessed with sunny days in our southern French locations, even if we are a 5-hour drive from each other. But it's great to be here and to be talking about the kinds of things that you've been interested in for some time.
Absolutely.
So what would really be an interesting way to start is to understand how you got into the work that you do today. You know, what kinds of choices were you making as you grew up that led to you being so passionate about the things you're interested in now, employee engagement, sustainable careers, and many other things around those subjects? Give us a little picture of that, please.
Interesting. It's interesting that you say, as I grew up, because this is what I do now was nothing that I envisioned doing as a child.
And that is so often the case, isn't
it? Absolutely. As an undergraduate, I was a double major in theater arts and French. And then I ended up going to, my first job was in higher education in administration. Mm-hmm. And, I just was really drawn to the educational setting. I think I was interested in avoiding a more corporate setting. And then I went for my first master's degree was in higher education administration, but that's where I started learning about organizational behavior. I took courses on power and leadership and negotiation, et cetera. And so that is actually where the kind of spark began. And then I worked a little bit longer as an administrator, and then went back for a PhD in organizational behavior at Cornell. So that's where I, really dug in completely to the topics that I spend all of my time with today. And I wrote my dissertation on career strategies and on career self-management. So I've long had that as a real pillar of my interests. And then, between having then worked for 12 years as a management professor, first at a university in the US and then at a French business school, I did a lot of teaching and writing on leadership, on the conditions that help to promote the types of work environments where people can thrive and perform and be well, as well as the individual strategies and characteristics that promote that kind of thriving, well-being and high performance and growth. And then my own story, at the end of my academic career, I suffered a pretty severe burnout. So having already studied burnout academically, I then had this really intense personal experience of understanding what that was like. And that absolutely gave, some extra juice to my commitment to really support people, support leaders in creating the kinds of workplaces and learning the types of leadership competencies that enable them to have thriving workplaces, and for individuals in what is it that they can do to be learning and growing and performing while also having a high quality of experience at work and, being well, being engaged and thriving.
Wonderful. Well, it's funny, even before you told me about your own personal burnout, I was already thinking and wondering what sort of cases of cobbler's children being poorly shod career specialists can often be. Did we create and design our careers? Hell no. Certainly not in my case. And yet I've changed a lot. And it's interesting that you would have become interested in burnout before becoming an example of it.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've been completely intentional since having that experience and leaving that job. I mean, I have
Yes.
put into practice quite intentionally and consciously everything that I teach other people to do. So we don't necessarily go about it that way instinctively. I think that, despite the fact that universities and business schools have great career services offices, that people get hooked by a lot of limiting perspectives about what careers are, what's important, how you go about managing it. So I have really, every day I think about what can I do today to make sure that I'm providing the greatest value, that I'm learning, that I'm having the optimal experience. So it doesn't come naturally, though. It's something that we
Absolutely.
often
One has to
kind
fight
of
for it, I
find our
think.
way into.
Yeah. And I think one of the big challenges there is that, you may well, one may well arrive at the sort of maturity of thinking to figure that out for oneself, perhaps in, from early 40s onwards, as, life starts to become a little less pink and rosy than it might have been painted when we were 21. But
Right.
it's also fascinating that that universities and the definitions of careers, early careers, can be still so narrow, so focused on going and working at McKinsey and being proud of working 16 hours a day and only getting 6 hours of sleep.
Right.
What kind of life is that? And in what universe is it sensible to be aspiring to that? But the temptation to conform to those norms is so high in those early years. So the fact that you are deliberate in your teaching of that is wonderful, and that you now live as the example of it is superb. If you had to define one definition of optimal work-life integration, I understand and realize that it's going to be different for each of us, but what components would you put into your definition of optimal work-life balance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For me, it's about I think it really turns on having a clear sense of priorities of what's most important to you in both of those domains, and of being able to perform well and to have a sense of satisfaction, have a sense of engagement in both of those domains. And that really shifts over the course of the career. I mean, you talk about kind of the young, freshly minted MBA who's working for a strategy consulting firm, incredibly long hours. And, at that stage, if you're in your late 20s, you actually may have optimal work-life integration, because at that sort of developmental stage of your career, you're really interested in challenge, you're really interested in growing. You maybe don't have a whole lot of demands in your non-work life that are impinging upon the amount of energy you can invest. But that, as you've indicated, is very rarely sustainable. So I think that optimal work-life integration is going to co-evolve along with the evolution of a person as you go through life stages, as you move through your career. I mean, one of the career models that I've been fond of for a long time, what arose from a bunch of research that was conducted in the US, and it's called the ABC model, and it brings together authenticity, balance, and challenge. So this model finds that people tend to be focused on challenge in early career years. That tends to shift towards a greater emphasis on balance as people begin to have much, much fuller lives with, childcare, elder care, marriage, other interests, et cetera, at mid-career. And then moving into later career, people tend to have a real yearning for authenticity, work that matches their values, work where they can have some self-expression of what they care about most. And so if you look at work-life integration through that lens, it's going to be shifting over time. There will be times of your life where making sure that you have time to be with grandchildren, or that you have time to invest in your community, is going to really be an important part of your overall conception of success. But I think that for most people, there's a real struggle that emerges from the expectations of other people who get imposed, whether that is expectations of your profession, of your organization, that an ideal worker shows up as somebody who always responds to an email within 30 minutes, somebody who is never visibly tired, somebody who is always happy to get on that. Can you imagine? We used to all be getting on flights at 6 a.m. and we, perhaps at some point in the future that will resume, but certainly, the pandemic has not been accompanied by a lessening of demands from work. And it's also, I think this past year, we've seen so many people really having work and non-work demands crashing into each other in a way that was rather shocking for some people and heightening that tension.
Indeed.
So I think having a sense of what's truly essential at this particular time of life, realizing that work-life integration is going to look different at different stages of life and based on your own individual evolution as a person.
Absolutely. Which brings us back in the most basic sense to the need for self-awareness at all stages. If we don't have and develop that, then we won't be sensitive to the shift from the C to the B to the A, and be able to afford ourselves the conditions that we need. I'm thinking about self-awareness. You've done many coaching engagements with professionals for a very long time. If you think specifically about those who might be considering or have even been forced to leave a stable job in some sort of salaried context and move towards creating their own dream career, what advice do you tend to give, and what can you share with our listeners today?
Yeah, it's very interesting because there are a number of different threads that have to get pulled. There's the question of identity, particularly if somebody is coming out of an organization, an occupational field or a profession that really does have a very strong identity, where you really see yourself as I am this, the person who does this. I work for this particular organization for a long time, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm a professor, or I'm a consultant, etc. There's a sort of loosening that oftentimes people have to regroup a little bit and think, who is it? What's my true authentic self? How do I express that through whatever work I may be doing? Because oftentimes people have a sense of loss, sometimes of self, as they're leaving a particular job, particularly if it is under less than ideal circumstances, if there's been downsizing, or if they have been forced out in some way. So there's sort of the work on the level of identity. There's work around the narrative that you tell yourself and that you tell other people about what choices you're making and why. There is the work of getting very clear on how it is that you contribute when you're at your best. What are the strengths? What are the skills that you have from the past that you can leverage in other ways? So many times people who are accomplished professionals have this sense of the sunk costs phenomenon where, I'd like to make a change, but I don't want to, I've invested so much in this particular career. I don't want to lose that value. And oftentimes it is entirely possible to take all of the different building blocks that consist of different skills, different ways of contributing, value that you can create for clients who may be different from those you've been working for previously, and putting that together in a new way that enables you to do work that you find fulfilling, but do it in a different, perhaps relational context, where you have more autonomy, where maybe you have more opportunity to set the rules of your own engagement. And, so then you have to get comfortable with be able to confidently and authentically tell your new story of, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, this is how I contribute. And I find that most people, with the help of a coach, actually that stuff is not too far beneath the surface. That it can be really difficult on your own when you're faced with, reaching out to contacts, for example, that you've been out of touch with for a while, and saying to them, I'm out on the market, or I'd like to learn more about what you're doing and explore that as a career path. That it can be incredibly intimidating, even for people who, who are super, if they were calling, reaching out on behalf of someone else, there'd be no problem whatsoever. But there's this thing about now I'm, in the spotlight. Now I'm the person that needs help, that needs to grow, and it's almost like it can feel like you've been stripped naked on stage, essentially, to be able to do that. So I do a lot of work with shifting people into a state where they really feel confident, they're connected to their strengths, they are able to, kind of practice articulating what it is they're doing and why it makes sense. So I think that those are some of the core things: working with identity, working with narratives, using the building blocks of skills, of values, of conditions that to be conducive to your performance, and putting that all together in a way that you can articulate it very authentically.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, you've done work with all kinds of different organizations. As you said earlier, the United Nations has this special university sort of context, which is enormous. As I started to dig into it, and I'm interested to know a little bit more about some of the principles and tools that you've been developing around the sort of work you've been talking about, thinking about whether it's purpose or resilience or self-compassion. Tell me a little bit about how you've developed the different tools in your box, and what sort of examples or principles we could hear about that would really make these come to life.
Yeah, interesting. I do. I have been working pretty extensively with United Nations leaders in different agencies since 2015, essentially, when I started working with the UN System Staff College. So at this point in time, I was, going through sort of my coaching log that I maintain for renewing my credentials. And I've now coached over 200 UN leaders, as well as, had thousands of people come through leadership programs in which I've been a faculty member. So that sort of represents
quite a number. Congratulations.
a big chunk of a whole world that I've gotten to know. And then in my own, my private clients come from all sorts, full range. I mean, people in finance or marketing or creative industries or, consulting or technology, medical research, et cetera. But, it's really been interesting getting to know this world of the UN and of international humanitarian organizations, development organizations, and so forth, because it's probably the most complex organizational system in the world. It's the most multicultural organization in the world. Mm-hmm. So my work has taken me to corners of the earth that I, never would have thought of. And on a given week, if I'm actively coaching in a leadership program, I might have calls with people who are in 20 different nations, including ones that tourists never get to around the world. So I've just heard, the stories and the backgrounds of people in so many different fields, which has really been fascinating. But there are certain threads, that pull through the work I do with the UN and the work I do with clients in corporate settings. So I draw a lot on positive psychology. And as you've said, things like having a sense of purpose, learning how to create the kinds of relationships that are energizing, that promote vitality, that build trust and mutual respect. And practicing these kinds of skills are, incredibly worthwhile because it helps you, the person who is learning to become more interpersonally agile, to thrive rapidly. And it also enables you to create powerful relationships that are much more collaborative, even with people that you may have had some conflict with or that you're not sure that you trust. So purpose, for example, like in the UN, everybody who joins the UN takes an oath to uphold the core values of the United Nations, which are integrity, professionalism, and respect for diversity. And so despite one's national identification, despite one's politics, despite one's all of the different demographic and sort of affinity groups that, oftentimes people will really come together around a sense of these core values being very, very meaningful to them. And people in international development and humanitarian organizations are often drawn to that work out of a deep commitment to help the beneficiaries to carry out the mandate. So I find it very useful when working with groups from particular organizations to drill down and get a sense of what at the core do we all share here, what's really meaningful for us. And I engage all the time in conversations about what are you experiencing as most meaningful in your work. So that is something that can be really help to take a group of people from, the kind of surface level conflicts that may be existing around how we're getting work done, how we're organizing things, who has the control of the budget, et cetera, who will and won't share information, into a deeper sense of connectedness around what is it that we're truly trying to accomplish together. And that can often form a foundation for building more collaborative innovation. And, other elements of positive leadership that I emphasize a lot is in my writing. I've been writing for Harvard Business Review for almost 10 years now. So I've got a few dozen articles that are there, and if you go through those, you'll see that there's a real emphasis on being the kind of leader who really ignites a sense of engagement. Being able to connect to people, being able to recognize people, being able to kind of steward the energy in the group, so that recognizing what is it that we're doing, what are the conditions in our work that might be draining, learning how to limit those, learning how to build energy in terms of people's ability to focus, in terms of people's sense of connectedness and strong relationships, in terms of a sense of purpose. So there are lots of things that leaders can do. And unfortunately, for so many people, work is the kind of struggles that people experience at work, whether it's burnout, whether it's a sense of overwhelm, whether it's a loss of meaning. We tend to experience these challenges as individual and feel quite isolated in that experience, even though, as I'm sure you have observed in your own coaching work, there's a vast community of people around the world who are experiencing the exact same challenges.
Oh, yeah.
And the immediate solutions to them tend to be individual in nature. So I think that anything that people can do to be in meaningful conversation with others, as we've seen during this pandemic year, can be really, really life-giving. So I help people at different levels, at the individual level, to kind of keep track of where's my energy coming from, what's draining it, how do I, basic principle, observe what drains you and what energizes you, and lean towards the energizing experiences, relationships, thought patterns, and away from those that are more draining. And then you can scale that up into groups and into organizations.
That's fascinating. Thank you. It brings to mind one of the things that we were interested in understanding from you, and that is any observations on the differences between, let's say, the US and continental Europe, in terms of the ways organizations see career management, or indeed how individuals perceive the management of their own careers. We've got our own lens on that, but we'd love to hear about how you perceive that.
It's interesting. I have been working in such a global space for so many years now that I don't necessarily, it's pretty rare that I work with an organization that really is just national in orientation. But I would say some of the differences that I have observed, I think the US has been one of the, I think due to the fact that there's such a strong strain of individualism, perhaps, and somewhat of an idea of anti-elitism, even though that's sort of belied by the socioeconomic structure that can be observed. But there's a greater sense of being able to create your own career, not being bound by sort of, here's what I studied, here's where I got my degree, here's the work that I've done. I think people embrace this a little bit more, kind of having a career that moves across different types of work, different organizations as being pretty normal. I know in France and in Germany, places like that, you get tracked pretty early in the educational process into what your pathway will be. And it can seem pretty challenging to a number of the people I've worked with that you could actually make a change if you feel like this is, this area of work is just simply not that fascinating for me anymore. But I do always find it fascinating, I think, when I ask people about the ways in which they have done some sort of unique, individually initiated job crafting through their experience of work, that most of us, as we go through work, we'll find ways to do more of what we do really well, what we enjoy. Maybe that's with the help of a mentor or someone who has extended themselves to us, or will have known people who have been able to do this. I always try and help people to dig into what are the experiences they've had when they've actually been able to accomplish something interesting, when they have not been burdened by the assumptions they might be carrying currently, and think about how they might implement that in their current situation. And it's interesting because even people who, kind of see the idea of job crafting or changing the job you currently have in some way to make it better aligned with what you care about, that this is a sort of frivolous or unrealistic thing to do, oftentimes in observing their own career path, can see places where they have done that and it's had a positive impact on how they perform. It's easy to sort of look back at one's career and construct a narrative of it that makes it seem as though it was all quite coherent.
Yes.
But oftentimes that coherence is imposed post hoc. And there's a lot of experimentation in the moment. There's always an element of luck. So I think that kind of what I would offer to people who may have come up through in a national setting or an educational setting in which there is an expectation that you're going to know at age 16 or 18 that you want to be, an engineer or you want to be a physician, and that will never change.
Yeah.
To be aware that in fact, we continue to evolve as human beings as we grow, as we age, as we move through our lives, and that to the extent that we are able to make small and sometimes large shifts in the way that we're working and in what we're doing as the content of our work that enable us to perform better, to have a sense of renewal, a sense of energy, a sense of deeper interest in the work that we're doing, that is all to the good, both for ourselves as healthy, thriving human beings and for the organizations that employ us. So, I'm sure you've heard that thing that said, the only thing worse than not being able to fire a low performer is, what if that low performer decides to stay or something like that. I'm messing it up a little bit, but the idea of being, one thing I've certainly observed in countries where, there's a sort of expectation supported by labor law, et cetera, that, people will just stay, is that it's tough when you have people who are feeling pretty cynical, really disengaged, et cetera. And I'm not saying that the answer is to be able to fire people, because that often is applied without any efforts to actually make the conditions of work more engaging. But to be in that state, to be feeling really disengaged, that work is just sort of, the thing you have to do so that you can live your life outside of it, is, that diminishes the quality of your experience as a human being. I really feel that work, that every single one of us has the capacity and the right to do work that lifts us up, that helps to bring out the best of us. But we also have, somewhat of a responsibility to bring that into being through our own attitudes, through our own conscious experimentation.
You can't expect to be served it on a plate.
Exactly.
So let's go back specifically to the question of burnout. We've talked about some of the sort of aspects of career planning and creation that might prevent it, but we all know, everyone who's listening knows that this is a particularly unusual period in modern history, and that more people than ever will be experiencing some sort of burnout. If you had to give us the quick Cliff's Notes version of what we should be doing to avoid it, or indeed if we've got there, what we might be needing to do to treat it and deal with it, what would you tell us?
Well, first of all, very basically what burnout is. It's a word that's being used a great deal right now, and it does have a specific definition. So I'll just give you that. First of all, it's an occupational stress syndrome that has 3 components. The first one is exhaustion, and it's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum engagement in terms of energy, attitude, and sense of capacity. So the first thing of exhaustion, people who are experiencing burnout oftentimes will have a sense of exhaustion, particularly emotional exhaustion. So if you're feeling just absolutely wrung out, drained from your work, like you have nothing left to give, that's a red flag that you might want to keep an eye on. The second element is around attitude. So burnout tends to be accompanied by a feeling of cynicism. And it may be that you started your work, you started your job at your organization with a great sense of commitment, a great sense of this is very meaningful, I'm really enthusiastic about this work. And over time, you have come to experience it as having been drained of that meaning. And you're feeling negative. You may be feeling very cynical towards the organization, your coworkers, your clients even. So that is the second element. And then the third one is a sense of reduced professional efficacy. So oftentimes people who are burned out will be feeling like my work just isn't making a difference. This is useless, or this has become so much harder. I'm so much more overwhelmed than I used to be. And this often leads to a really downward spiral where the person really needs to renew, refresh, take some time off, step back, regain their footing. But because we feel overwhelmed, we try and work harder, we stay up later, we can't stop thinking about it. And this is just ever more draining. So if you're listening and you're feeling like, oh yeah, I have definitely 2 or 3 of those things, that's an indication that it's a good idea to step back, because burnout doesn't tend to resolve on its own. It tends to get worse. And as I was saying earlier, this tends often to be treated as an individual problem. From the outside, depending upon how it shows up externally on you, it might look like low performance. It might look like bad attitude. It might look like this person is unwell. People express it in different ways, but if you can imagine that it's a combination of exhaustion, cynicism, and a sense of reduced personal efficacy, oftentimes the burned out person kind of looks like a problem employee. Hopefully, if you're experiencing this, you're in an organization where people know you and are concerned about your well-being and may say, hey, what's going on? You don't seem to be yourself these last few months. What's happening, and how can I support you, etc. That is an optimal outcome. But a lot of times people who are experiencing burnout are left to kind of sort through it on their own. And when you're in that state, it's even harder to take action on your own behalf. So a lot of times people who are burned out may think, I just don't think I can work here anymore. I think it's time for me to switch. That's a tough mental state to be in, to kind of go out and make connections and network and show up as your best self at a job interview. So it's really important to try and prevent it, to keep an eye on your own levels of energy, of kind of how am I feeling about work? What's my level of overwhelm? Am I, able to get up in the morning and feel hopeful? Am I able to, at the end of the day, do I have a sense of having accomplished something? And there are, certain little things that we can do, like making sure that you build some regular reflection time in. I think one thing, if people who are feeling overwhelmed take 5 minutes each day to say, like, here's the single most important thing I need to do today in order for me to feel that today was a success. And here's what I accomplished today. That having a sense of progress like that is one of the most powerfully motivating states that we can experience as human beings. Making sure that we are engaging in connections with people who we find energizing. When we're burned out, there's a tendency to kind of turn inward. It feels like we don't have the time to have, a kind of Zoom apéro with somebody or have a coffee and laugh a little bit. But those kinds of exchanges are really, really life-giving. And oftentimes we need to, it does not tend to be strictly an individual problem. If you're feeling burned out in your organization, undoubtedly a bunch of your colleagues are too. So the most powerful interventions tend to come around a whole team coming together and saying, how are we experiencing, what's our collective capacity? And to what extent are we at the limit or even over the limit? Let's look at how we can work differently. What would make a difference? What if we didn't send or receive any emails in the evening or on the weekends? Can we do that? Can we kind of commit ourselves to maybe, writing them if we need to, but they don't go out until Monday morning? Are there ways that when we get on our team call, we say we're going to take 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning to check in, to have everybody share, something they've enjoyed that has happened in the last few days, or some success, or to kind of get into a regular practice of offering help to each other people. There's lots of different little changes that we can make that are going to boost that energy, that are going to bring more positive energy in and cut a little bit the draining, the things that we're doing often unconsciously, just out of habit, that are making it more exhausting for us.
I think that we've had some incredibly valuable insight and advice from you. I've loved hearing about how your journey has driven your own interests and specialities. The work with these truly international leaders in that extraordinary organization, which is the UN, is fascinating. And I feel that on a personal note, I could spend 3 hours more with you at least.
Yeah.
The time for a good lunch and learn lots more. But let's wrap it up by one final question, which is, what's on your horizon in terms of next anything? And might that be tied up with a place you might go? I think many of us are in that strange in-between stage where we're thinking about where we might go next geographically when we can. But just tell us about something that's on your horizon that could be stimulating or inspiring.
So, as I mentioned earlier, I have constructed this career. I basically have what I sometimes refer to as a post bullshit career. So when I burned out, I kind of said, okay, clean slate, clean it all off, and then let's put in only things that I find fulfilling and engaging. And so that is how I choose what I'm going to engage in next. I just had an opportunity. I was in a conversation with a potential partner to do a consulting project a couple of weeks ago. And I decided using, is this going to be engaging? Is it going to be fulfilling? That actually, I thought, no, it's not. So I declined that opportunity. And, so what is next for me is just to continue this practice of cultivating great professional connections, finding people with similar values sets and similar objectives that we're trying to, bring more life into the workplace and help people to be more skillful in creating motivating environments. So I continue to do that. This, of course, has been a year of online delivery. I've been fortunate to work with some colleagues who have been pretty innovative in figuring out how to bring really engaging programs and leadership development and group coaching online to people around the world. So I'm continuing to do that. And, for me, it's really been, I like working this way. I didn't mind at all the travel that I used to do, but I have to tell you, I've hiked about 1,000 miles in the past year. It's been fantastic. And I've realized that, I think, even when we've all got our vaccine passports, I suspect that there's going to be less business travel for quite some time, or perhaps permanently. So I look forward to continuing to innovate with delivering meaningful transformational experiences to people virtually that help people to grow and to learn and to get more of what they want in their lives. And when I finally get on a plane, I will be flying to Boston in the US. That's where my family is based, and haven't seen them now since Christmas of 2019. So that is the only thing I have on my travel wish list right now. Like you, I live in an incredibly beautiful area where I can take advantage of nature and beautiful landscapes, etc. So I continue to be pretty healthy and happy and look forward to continuing that.
Wonderful, Monique. Thank you. That's a beautiful summary, I think, that many can empathize with. So I want to take a moment just to thank you for being with me today and sharing all of this stuff. It's been a real pleasure. I know that the audience is going to love it. So let's keep talking offline. But in the meantime,
Lovely.
let's wrap up. And with great thanks to you, wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Claire.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.